Ethan Walker sat motionless, his eyes locked on the glowing cursor at the center of his monitor. He was deep into a complex architecture project, the kind he hoped would define his career. A notification chimed. Cutting through the silence of the office, he clicked the icon. A client message popped up, asking for a specific software integration he did not offer. Ethan frowned, his jaw tightening. He dragged the window to the corner of his screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was a distraction. It was a request for something simple, something beneath the scope of the high-level work he was trying to build. He shook his head, let out a sharp, audible exhale, and slammed the mouse button to close the window. The cursor returned to the middle of the screen. He tried to focus on his code, but the rhythm of his work had been broken. He leaned back, the chair frame creaking against the wall. He stared at the blank space where the message had been, feeling the familiar weight of frustration. He was looking for a breakthrough, not a list of chores from people who did not understand his vision. He turned away from the screen, staring at the empty wall, waiting for the distraction to fade so he could return to what he deemed important. 48 hours later, the chime returned. Ethan was halfway through a complex function when the same notification header appeared. A new client, the same request. He stared at the screen, his hand resting on the mouse. He deleted the message without responding, but the irritation felt different this time, sharper and more persistent. He had barely settled back into his work when a third notification pinged. Then a fourth. He stopped typing. The silence of the office felt suddenly heavy. He pulled up his project management dashboard, clicking through the archives of the last few weeks. He searched for keywords. He filtered by request type. The results appeared in a list that scrolled down the screen. 3 separate clients, in 3 different time zones, all asking for the exact same tool. He pushed his chair back from the desk, the wheels scraping against the floorboards. He stood up and began to walk, his pace uneven. The irritation remained, but it was being pushed aside by a cold, nagging curiosity. He looked at his screen again. The pattern was not a coincidence. It was a signal. He stopped pacing and leaned over his desk, his eyes darting between the messages, searching for the connection he had missed. Ethan paced the length of his office, his boots clicking against the hardwood floor. Each lap took exactly 6 strides. He turned at the window, staring out at the street below, then pivoted back to his desk. For years, he had been waiting for a thunderclap of inspiration, a world-changing revelation that would announce itself with fanfare. He wanted a grand announcement, something that would cement his status as an innovator. Instead, he was being pestered by recurring requests for a service he did not provide. The irony gnawed at him. He stopped pacing and leaned against the doorframe, looking back at the glow of his monitor. The screen showed the list of client needs, simple and repetitive. They were not brilliant. They were not world-changing in the way he had imagined success to be. He looked around the room, at the whiteboard filled with half-finished project diagrams and the stacks of books on design theory. He had been so focused on reaching for the horizon that he had failed to see the ground directly beneath his feet. The grand idea was a delusion he had built to protect himself from the mundane. He realized then that he had been ignoring the obvious needs of his clients simply because they were not dramatic enough to fit his ego. Ethan walked to his desk and cleared a space among the clutter. He reached into the bottom drawer, pulling out a worn notebook he had not opened in months. He flipped through the blank pages until he found a fresh spread. He uncapped his pen, the plastic clicking firmly in the quiet room. He wrote the client's request in thick, bold letters, pressing hard enough to indent the paper. He stared at the ink. It was not a grand concept, but it was real. He recalled a line from a book on his shelf. Opportunity often arrives disguised as ordinary events. He looked at the bold text, then back at the list of complaints on his monitor. The urge to wait for a perfect, world-changing breakthrough vanished. He set the pen down and closed the drawer. The drama he had been chasing was a distraction. He was done looking for lightning in a bottle. He turned his chair toward the whiteboard, picked up a dry erase marker, and started to map the recurring data points. The search for the extraordinary was over. The search for the pattern had begun. Ethan committed to the next 7 days with the intensity of a man hunting a ghost. He kept the notebook open at all times, sitting beside his keyboard like a weapon. Every incoming message became a data point. When a client complained about a slow integration, he didn't just apologize. He took notes on the specific error code and the time of day. He received an email from an irate user who had spent 2 hours trying to sync a basic file. Ethan felt the familiar sting of annoyance, but he pushed it down, analyzing the frustration instead. He transcribed the user's specific complaints verbatim. He began to look for the invisible connections between these grievances. Why did they all fail at the same point in the workflow? He categorized the issues by frequency, color-coding the entries in his notebook. The process felt like piecing together a broken puzzle. He was no longer just managing support tickets. He was investigating the mechanics of a market failure. Every question asked, every feature requested, and every moment of user hesitation was a clue. By the 5th day, he wasn't just collecting information. He was seeing the shape of a problem that no one else had bothered to name. Ethan stood before the blank whiteboard, marker hovering over the smooth white surface. He began transferring the data from his notebook, drawing sharp lines between unrelated complaints to see where they intersected. He mapped the workflow failures in red and the user feature requests in blue. The whiteboard quickly filled with a spiderweb of connections. He stepped back, wiping a smudge of ink from his thumb. The pattern was undeniable. A gaping hole in the software ecosystem stared back at him. He realized why his competitors ignored these requests. They viewed them as minor annoyances from non-essential users. They were too focused on building complex premium features that nobody actually asked for. They were blind to the frustration of the everyday user. Ethan leaned in, tracing the path from the most common complaint to the most requested solution. He saw the path that others refused to take. It was not a hidden secret. It was a neglected opportunity, sitting in plain sight because the industry giants were too proud to look down. He drew a bold circle around the center of the web. The gap was massive, and for the first time, he knew exactly how to bridge it. The whiteboard was no longer just a wall. It was a blueprint for a business. Ethan turned away from the whiteboard and opened his banking app. The balance was steady, a safety net built through years of cautious freelance work. He looked at the blueprint on the wall, then back at the numbers on his screen. With a single tap, he initiated a transfer that emptied his savings account to pay for the initial server infrastructure and development tools. The screen flashed a confirmation, and his account dropped to near zero. A cold spike of adrenaline hit his stomach. The reality of his decision settled in. There was no longer a buffer between him and failure. He pulled his chair to the desk and sat down. The silence of the office felt heavier now, but the internal noise had vanished. He opened his code editor and started the first file of the prototype. Every keystroke was a commitment to the path he had mapped. He felt the weight of the risk in his trembling fingers, yet his mind had never been sharper. He was no longer building a tool for a client. He was building his own future. He worked through the afternoon, ignoring the hunger, ignoring the clock, and ignoring the doubt that tried to creep into the edges of his focus. He was all in. The phone calls started on Tuesday. His friends had heard about the empty savings account and the abandoned freelance contracts. They came to his office in pairs, leaning against the doorframe, their voices low and measured. They spoke of the market, of economic uncertainty, and of the wisdom in playing it safe. One friend sat on the edge of the desk, pointing to the open code editor. "You are trading a guaranteed paycheck for a gamble." He said. "Go back to the contracts. Take the steady work. Protect what you have built." Ethan listened, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Their logic was sound. It was the same logic he had followed for years. It was the path of least resistance. He watched them pace his small office, their gestures wide and frantic, contrasting sharply with his own stillness. He looked at the whiteboard, then back at his friends. He saw the gap in the market clearly, while they only saw the gap in his bank account. He stood up, walked to the desk, and turned his back to them, facing his monitor. "I am not chasing a trend," he said, his voice steady. "I am solving a problem that everyone else is too afraid to name." He heard the door close behind them. He did not look back. He returned to the keyboard, his focus absolute, letting the silence of the room confirm his choice. The screen flickered, the cursor blinking in a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the thumping in his ears. Ethan pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, his eyes burning from hours of unfiltered light. He typed the final line of logic, a sequence that bridged the gap between his whiteboard notes and the functional software. A system error flashed in red across the terminal. He inhaled sharply, his fingers hovering over the keys. The panic was instantaneous. He traced the lines back, hunting the syntax break with desperate precision. He found the missing semicolon corrected it, and hit enter. The screen turned green. Success. He sat back, the chair groaning under his weight. The prototype was live on his local server. He took a breath, the room suddenly feeling too small for the ambition he held in his hands. He opened the email draft. 5 addresses were already typed into the field. His mouse cursor hovered over the button. The weight of his entire future hung on that single mechanical click. He didn't look away. He didn't hesitate for the sake of comfort. He stared at the screen, every heartbeat counting down the seconds until he would release his work into the world. He felt the cold air of the office against his skin, the silence of the building pressing in, and the absolute finality of the moment. He moved the mouse, tightened his grip, and prepared to commit. The cursor clicked. The email vanished into the digital void, carrying his months of labor to the 5 people who had demanded it most. Ethan pushed the keyboard away and stood. The room suddenly felt hollow. He walked to the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life against the darkening sky, but his mind remained tethered to the server logs. He returned to his desk every 3 minutes to refresh the inbox. The screen remained blank. The white space seemed to grow larger with each passing second, mocking his certainty. He paced the length of the floorboards, counting his steps, trying to quiet the sudden sharp spike of anxiety in his chest. What if the tool was too complex? What if the timing was wrong? He sat down again, staring at the blinking cursor, willing a notification to appear. The silence of the office was no longer a tool for focus. It was a weight. He clasped his hands together, knuckles turning white, and forced himself to watch the clock. Every minute that crawled by stretched like an hour. He had bet everything on this connection, and now he was entirely at the mercy of their response. He did not move. He did not look away. He simply waited for the world to answer. The silence in the office was absolute until a soft, chime-like notification pierced the air. Ethan straightened, his eyes snapping to the monitor. A new email. He clicked the icon, his breath hitching as he read the first line. "Can I purchase access to this immediately?" Before his finger could even leave the mouse button, a second notification pinged, then a third. The rhythm of his heart accelerated, thumping hard against his ribs. He clicked through the messages, his eyes darting across the text. Each one asked the same question. What is the price? The doubt that had anchored him to his chair for the last hour evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He stood up abruptly, the chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a sharp thud. He didn't sit back down. He paced the small perimeter of the room, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his desk. 3 replies in less than an hour. The data he had mapped on the whiteboard was no longer just a theory, it was a demand. He looked at the screen again, the blue light reflecting in his eyes, and realized the path forward had finally materialized. He was no longer waiting for permission. He was in business. The launch button was a simple gray rectangle on his screen. Ethan clicked it. By Monday morning, the service was live, public, and open to the world. He spent the first few hours watching the traffic metrics climb, his eyes tracing the jagged lines of data as new users trickled in. By noon, the initial burst of activity slowed to a crawl. He opened his banking dashboard to tally the first month of receipts. The total was there, blinking in green text. It barely covered the monthly hosting fees and the server maintenance costs. He refreshed the page, hoping for a hidden error, but the number remained fixed. The silence returned to the office, but this time it carried a different weight. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty, but the cold reality of overhead. He looked at his depleted savings account, the balance reflecting months of sacrifice. The grand vision he had built was functioning, but it was not yet sustainable. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the street below. Every person walking by was a potential user, yet they were all strangers to his work. He turned back to the desk, pulled his chair in, and stared at the lines of code. The dream had arrived, but it was starving. The office became a cage of flickering monitors. Ethan stopped tracking the passage of time by the sun and started tracking it by the cooling temperature of his coffee. Days blurred into a singular, grueling routine. He spent his mornings and afternoons tethered to the support inbox, drafting personalized responses to every user complaint, his fingers aching from the constant friction against the keys. Every ticket was a new demand for stability. By night, he moved to the terminal, his eyes burning as he scanned thousands of lines of code for the errors that caused the system to stutter. He slumped against the desk, the hard wood digging into his ribs, and forced himself to keep typing. The silence of the building was broken only by the hum of the cooling fan. Around 3 in the morning, the server went dark. A critical failure. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. He simply dragged his chair closer to the screen, his vision tunneling into the command line. He worked through the darkness until the streetlights outside began to dim, his head throbbing in rhythm with the blinking cursor. He was physically depleted, his muscles stiff and his movements heavy, but his focus remained locked. He hit the final commit command and watched the system stabilize. Ethan changed his strategy. Instead of treating user suggestions as tasks to be scheduled, he treated them as immediate, non-negotiable mandates. When a support ticket arrived, he didn't just log it. He opened the source code and began carving it into the framework. At midnight, a user requested a data export feature that required a complete overhaul of the database schema. Most competitors would have queued this for a quarterly update. Ethan opened a fresh terminal window, his fingers flying across the keys with frantic precision. He dismantled the existing logic, replaced the core modules, and rebuilt the integration from the ground up. He did not pause for sleep. He did not step away for water. He watched the progress bars advance on his screen, the system responding to his commands in real time. By the time the first rays of morning light hit his desk, the feature was live. He pushed the update, refreshed the live server, and saw the confirmation message appear. The product was no longer static. It was a living, breathing entity that evolved faster than any traditional developer could track. He had turned the software into a mirror of his users' needs, updated every single dawn. The change arrived on a Tuesday. Ethan refreshed the administrative dashboard, expecting the usual handful of active sessions. Instead, the number jumped. 100, then 500, then 1,000. The graph line turned vertical, climbing the screen with a speed that made his pulse quicken. He gripped the edge of his desk, watching the load balancer struggle to keep pace with the incoming traffic. For a moment, the server latency spiked, threatening to crash the entire build under the sudden weight of new users. He held his breath, fingers hovering over the override keys, ready to dump the cache and protect the integrity of the data. The system stuttered, the progress wheel spinning in a blur, before the metrics settled into a smooth, upward curve. He leaned back, the blue light of the monitor illuminating his face as he realized the trend was no longer an anomaly. It was a surge. The trickle of the early months had vanished, replaced by a constant, rhythmic flow of new registrations. He clicked through the live feed, watching the map populate with pins from across the globe. The software was finally holding its own weight. He let his hands fall to his lap, watching the numbers climb, the reality of the shift sinking in with every new notification pinging against the silence of the room. The office walls felt like they were shrinking. Ethan could no longer manage the demand alone. He hired his first engineer, then 2 more, conducting interviews at 3 a.m. to catch candidates in different time zones. He had to learn to trust someone else with his code. He spent the first month peering over shoulders, testing every pull request, until he realized his team had adopted his obsession for user feedback. They worked in sync, deploying features across continents while he slept. The operation outgrew the single server in his closet. He leased space in data centers in London, Tokyo, and New York to ensure the software remained fast for every user, regardless of their location. He stood in the center of the new headquarters, watching a wall of monitors that displayed live traffic from 3 continents at once. The team moved with a quiet, efficient intensity, solving bugs before users even reported them. He walked the rows of desks, checking the metrics, feeling the rhythm of a company that was now operating on a global scale. He no longer needed to write every line of code. He had built something that could breathe and grow without his constant intervention. The boardroom doors were shut, sealing out the hum of the office. Ethan moved to the head of the table and pulled the digital report onto his screen. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the trackpad. This was the final audit of the fiscal year. He clicked. The document expanded, highlighting the revenue growth, the operational costs, and the final net valuation. The number was there, bold and precise, sitting just above the 7-figure mark. He read it once, then a second time, letting the digits sink in. The silence in the room felt heavier than it had 10 minutes ago. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the city traffic move like a slow pulse far below. He had spent years tracking complaints and mapping patterns, living on coffee and code, and now the math finally matched the effort. He turned back to the screen, scrolling through the breakdown of the last 2 years. Every spike in the graph, Every solved ticket and every user request was accounted for in the balance sheet. He did not celebrate with a shout or a toast. He simply sat down, gripped the edge of the mahogany table, and stared at the total. The $1,000,000 reality was no longer a goal. It was a ledger entry. The boardroom remained quiet, the air conditioned and still. Ethan shifted his gaze away from the monitor and reached into his bag. His fingers brushed against a stack of papers before finding the edges of a worn, spiral-bound notebook. He pulled it out and laid it on the mahogany surface. The cover was creased, the corners frayed from years of being shoved into desk drawers and pockets. He opened to the middle section, where ink stains and aggressive scribbles marked the days he had spent mapping client complaints. He traced a line of his own handwriting, noting the specific dates he had recorded every request for that software integration. The contrast was sharp. The room around him was polished, expensive, and perfectly ordered, yet his eyes stayed locked on the messy, handwritten roadmap of his starting point. He flipped a page, finding a checklist of features he had promised to build when he had no money and no team. He felt the texture of the paper under his thumb, rough and real against the smooth, synthetic finish of the conference table. Every $1,000,000 gain was rooted in these pages. He set his hand flat on the notebook, feeling the weight of the ink, and took a slow breath. The transition from that small office to this height was not a leap, but a steady climb, one page at a time. The office door pushed open, and the young intern stepped in, holding a tablet. He walked to the table and looked at the boardroom setup, then fixed his gaze on Ethan. He asked how a niche so specific could lead to such massive scale. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at the intern, then turned his chair to fully face him. He reached for the notebook, sliding it across the table until it sat between them. The intern leaned in, staring at the messy, handwritten list of client complaints. Ethan tapped the paper with his index finger. He said, "The opportunity was talking. I just finally decided to listen." The intern looked at the notes, then back at Ethan, his expression shifting from curiosity to realization. There was no secret algorithm or hidden mentor. It was simply the act of paying attention to the noise others chose to ignore. Ethan watched the intern process the statement, his own hands resting firmly on the table. He did not chase the trends that dominated the industry. He did not wait for the perfect market conditions to appear. He simply pointed to the ink on the page, showing the intern that the roadmap to his current reality had been visible for years, provided one was willing to sit still and hear the request. The intern nodded, closed his tablet, and exited the room. Ethan watched the door latch shut, leaving him in the quiet of the boardroom. He looked back down at the notebook. The ink was dry. The pages were yellowed, but the data remained as sharp as the day he wrote it. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the cool support of the leather against his spine. The $1,000,000 reality he occupied was not a product of luck or massive, sweeping gambles. It was the result of 1,000 small, whispered signals that everyone else had filtered out as background noise. He had simply stopped looking for the dramatic and started tracking the patterns. He closed the notebook and set it aside. Outside the glass walls, the city moved in a blur of motion, but he remained still. The lesson was complete. Success was not found in the pursuit of perfection, but in the willingness to acknowledge what was already standing in front of him. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the horizon. The world was full of gaps, full of complaints, and full of opportunities waiting for someone to pay attention. He did not need to invent the future. He only needed to listen to the present.